You think you have power. You have a badge and a computer screen. I have the federal government on speed dial. It started with a 13-year-old girl's backpack. It ended with an entire airline fleet grounded a stock market crash and a gate agent facing federal charges. When Linda Hayes decided to target the Washington family at gate D15, she didn't realize she was picking a fight with the one man who could legally shut down the sky. This isn't just a story about bad customer service. It's a masterclass in how power, when abused, can backfire in the most spectacular way possible. Buckle up. You've never seen karma delivered quite like this. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of Linda Hayes' studio apartment at exactly 5:30 a.m., the same time it had screamed for the past 23 years. She slammed her palm down on the snooze button, but there would be no reprieve today. Not with the new company policies breathing down her neck like hungry vultures. At 54, Linda had seen Prestige Airways transform from a respectable carrier into a corporate machine that measured employee worth in baggage fees collected and complaints avoided. Her divorce had been finalized just last month, and the alimony payments were bleeding her dry faster than she could earn them. The small apartment in Aurora, Illinois, with its water-stained ceiling and perpetually broken air conditioning, was all she could afford now. She stumbled to the kitchenette where a stack of bills waited on the counter like patient soldiers. Electric bill, credit card statement, mortgage payment for a house she no longer lived in. The math was simple and brutal. She needed this job for exactly 18 more months until her pension kicked in, and the company knew it. The memo from corporate headquarters still sat on her coffee table, its bold red letterhead mocking her morning coffee ritual. Performance Enhancement Initiative, they called it. What it really meant was that every gate agent now had quotas for additional fees collected, and failure to meet those numbers would result in performance counseling sessions that everyone knew were just polite firing squads. Linda's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who had been ground down by decades of dealing with entitled passengers, impossible company demands, and a life that hadn't turned out the way she'd planned. Her hair, once a vibrant auburn, now required monthly touch-ups to hide the gray, and her smile, which had once been genuine, had become a professional mask she wore for 8 hours a day. The commute to O'Hare International Airport was a familiar nightmare of crowded trains and delayed schedules. As she sat in the cramped Blue Line car, surrounded by other early morning workers who looked just as defeated as she felt, Linda thought about the warning her supervisor, Marcus Webb, had given her yesterday. "Linda, I need to see improvement in your numbers, or we're going to have a conversation about your future with the company." 23 years of service, and they were threatening her over baggage fees that most passengers couldn't even afford. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same company executives who lived in mansions and flew private jets were demanding she squeeze every possible dollar out of families just trying to visit their relatives. When she finally arrived at Terminal 2, the first sign that today would be different came when she spilled coffee on her uniform while rushing through the employee entrance. The brown stain spread across her blue blazer like a bad omen, and when she tried to clean it in the restroom, the paper towel dispenser was empty. Strike two came when her employee locker door, already hanging by one hinge, finally gave up completely and clattered to the floor. The gate assignment board showed her working gate D15 flight 447 to Atlanta, departing at 4:45 p.m. A Boeing 737 with 189 seats, which meant 189 opportunities to either meet her quota or face another performance counseling session with Marcus. The computer system was running slow again, a frequent occurrence that the IT department blamed on network optimization, but everyone knew was just corporate cost-cutting disguised in technical jargon. Meanwhile, 45 miles away in the affluent suburb of Highland Park, the Washington family was beginning their day with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of military precision mixed with legal thoroughness. Dr. David Washington, 55 years old, and carrying himself with the bearing of someone who had commanded fighter jets before commanding respect in federal office buildings, was preparing breakfast while his wife Angela reviewed case files at the kitchen island. David's morning routine hadn't changed much since his Navy days, up at 5 a.m., 20 minutes of exercise, shower, and then family time before the day's responsibilities took over. His graying temples and the fine lines around his eyes told the story of a man who had seen serious responsibility first as a naval aviator flying missions over hostile territory, and now as a senior aviation safety inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration. Angela, 52 and still striking in the way that successful women often are, was dressed in her typical work attire of a tailored suit that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable. As a federal public defender with a Harvard law degree, she had spent the last 15 years fighting for clients who couldn't afford to fight for themselves, and the experience had given her an almost supernatural ability to spot injustice from a mile away. Their daughter Zoe, 13, and caught in that awkward phase between childhood and adolescence, was carefully packing her small rolling suitcase with the methodical attention to detail she had inherited from both parents. She had been nervous about flying ever since seeing a news report about passenger mistreatment at airports, and her parents had spent considerable time reassuring her that such incidents were rare and that they knew how to handle any problems that might arise. Tyler, their 16-year-old son, was the picture of teenage confidence as he stuffed his basketball uniform into his duffel bag. The team was heading to Atlanta for a regional tournament, and this was his first time flying with the family rather than with the school group. At 6 feet 2 inches, and still growing, Tyler had inherited his father's height and his mother's sense of justice, a combination that sometimes got him into trouble at school when he witnessed bullying. The family discussion over breakfast centered around a case Angela was working on involving airport security discrimination, and David found himself explaining how federal regulations were supposed to protect passengers from exactly the kind of treatment her client had experienced. The important thing to remember, he told his children, is that everyone has rights, and those rights don't disappear just because you're in an airport or on an airplane. Zoe listened intently as her father explained how to measure carry-on bags properly and what questions passengers were allowed to ask if they felt they were being treated unfairly. Angela added her legal perspective about documenting interactions and knowing when to ask for supervisors or law enforcement. It was the kind of conversation that many families never have, but for the Washingtons, understanding rights and responsibilities was as natural as discussing the weather. As they loaded their carefully packed bags into David's SUV, none of them could have imagined that in a few hours all of this preparation and knowledge would be put to the ultimate test by a gate agent who was about to make the worst decision of her professional life. Terminal 2 at O'Hare International Airport hummed with the controlled chaos that defined air travel in America, a symphony of rolling luggage, boarding announcements, and the subtle tension that comes when hundreds of people are trying to get somewhere else as quickly as possible. The afternoon sun streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, where travelers moved with the purposeful determination of people who had places to be and schedules to keep. David Washington moved through this environment with the observational skills that had kept him alive in military cockpits and now helped him identify safety issues in commercial aviation. He noticed the frayed carpet near gate D15 that created a tripping hazard, the flickering fluorescent light above the departure board that would need maintenance, and most importantly, the visible stress lines around the gate agent's eyes that suggested someone operating under significant pressure. The family had arrived with their usual buffer time, a habit David had developed during his military career and maintained in civilian life, because he understood that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in aviation could be deadly. Angela was using the extra time to review notes for a case she would be working on next week, occasionally looking up to observe the gate area with the analytical eye of someone who had spent years studying human behavior in legal contexts. Zoe sat quietly beside her mother, clutching a worn stuffed elephant that she had owned since she was 5 years old. Her anxiety about flying mixed with excitement about visiting her cousin in Atlanta. She had carefully arranged her small backpack, a bright purple affair with sparkly handles that she had received for her 13th birthday, ensuring that her books and travel games were easily accessible, but that the bag remained compact enough to fit under the airplane seat. Tyler, meanwhile, had noticed an elderly couple struggling with their luggage and had quietly moved to help them, lifting their heavy bag into the overhead sizing bin to demonstrate that it would fit properly. It was the kind of instinctive helpfulness that his parents had modeled for years, and watching him assist strangers with no expectation of recognition made Angela smile with parental pride. Linda Hayes, from her position behind the gate podium, observed the Washington family with the kind of professional assessment that gate agents develop after years of managing passenger loads and dealing with the infinite variety of problems that air travel can create. She saw a well-dressed black family in the first-class boarding area, and her mind immediately began making the calculations that her job had trained her to make expensive luggage, confident posture tickets that probably cost more than she made in a week. The pressure from her supervisor's recent warning about fee collection weighed heavily on her mind as she dealt with the growing line of passengers who all seemed to have complaints about delayed flights, oversold seats, and the general deterioration of airline service that had become standard in the industry. Her computer screen showed her current numbers for the month, and the red text indicating her below-average performance felt like a constant reminder of her precarious employment situation. Marcus Webb, the gate supervisor, had made his expectations clear during their last conversation: find reasons to charge additional fees or find another job. It was a message delivered with corporate politeness but unmistakable menace, the kind of workplace bullying that happened in industries where workers were easily replaceable and companies prioritized profit margins over employee welfare. The afternoon light streaming through the terminal windows created an almost theatrical atmosphere as passengers began gathering for the boarding process. Business travelers checked their phones and tablets with the urgency of people whose livelihoods depended on staying connected. Families organized their children and carry-on bags with military precision. Elderly passengers settled into the uncomfortable gate area chairs with the patient resignation of people who had learned that air travel required endurance as much as money. David found himself automatically cataloging the various safety and security issues he observed throughout the terminal, a habit that was so ingrained he barely noticed he was doing it. The emergency exit signs that were partially blocked by advertising displays, the crowd control barriers that wouldn't function properly in an evacuation, the general wear and tear on infrastructure that suggested deferred maintenance becoming a safety concern. Angela, reviewing her case files on her tablet, occasionally looked up to study the interactions between airline employees and passengers, filing away observations that might be useful in her ongoing civil rights work. She had developed an attorney's eye for spotting the subtle signs of discrimination, and while she hoped never to need that knowledge personally, she was always prepared to document and challenge unfair treatment when she witnessed it. The public address system crackled to life with the standard pre-boarding announcements, but the quality was poor enough that many passengers had to strain to understand the information being conveyed. It was another small example of how cost-cutting measures affected the passenger experience in ways that airlines seemed to consider acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of higher profit margins. Zoe looked around the gate area with the curiosity of someone who didn't fly frequently enough for airports to have become mundane, taking in the diverse crowd of travelers who were all temporarily united by their shared destination. She noticed a mother trying to comfort a crying baby, a businessman arguing loudly into his phone about a missed connection, and a group of teenagers who appeared to be traveling together for some kind of competition or school event. Tyler, having finished helping the elderly couple, returned to his family and quietly pointed out various things he had observed, sharing his father's instinct for situational awareness. He had noticed that several passengers seemed frustrated with the gate agent's attitude during the pre-boarding process, and he mentioned to his parents that the employee appeared to be having a particularly stressful day. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would ultimately expose the vast difference between the power people think they have and the authority they actually possess when that perceived power comes into conflict with real federal oversight and genuine legal expertise backed by moral clarity. The boarding process began with the mechanical efficiency that characterized modern air travel passengers, forming orderly lines based on the group numbers printed on their boarding passes, while gate agents prepared to transform a crowd of individuals into an airplane full of seated passengers ready for departure. The atmosphere was typical for a Thursday afternoon flight, tired business travelers eager to get home, families managing children and carry-on bags, and the general undercurrent of mild anxiety that accompanied air travel in an era of reduced services and increased fees. Group 1 was called first, the familiar announcement echoing through the gate area with Linda Hayes's voice carrying just enough authority to command attention but not enough warmth to suggest that passenger service was anything more than a necessary irritation in the airline's business model. David Washington gathered his family and their belongings, double-checking that everyone had their boarding passes easily accessible and that their carry-on bags were properly arranged for the security screening that would occur at the gate. Angela Washington's roller bag moved smoothly across the polished terminal floor as the family approached the boarding desk, her legal training causing her to automatically observe the gate agent's demeanor and body language for any signs of the kind of discriminatory behavior that she dealt with professionally, but hoped never to encounter personally. Zoe clutched her small backpack nervously while Tyler carried both his own duffel bag and his sister's roller bag with the easy strength of a teenager who played varsity sports. David's boarding pass scanned with the familiar beep that indicated a successful reading, and Linda Hayes barely looked up from her computer screen as she waved him through toward the jet bridge. Her professional autopilot was engaged, the same mechanical routine she had performed thousands of times over her 23-year career. But her mind was calculating whether this family might provide an opportunity to add some additional fee revenue to her monthly performance numbers. Angela's pass scanned successfully as well, followed by Tyler's, each beep marking another passenger processed through the system with the kind of efficient indifference that airlines had perfected as a way to move large numbers of people without providing actual customer service. The process was working smoothly until Zoe stepped forward with her boarding pass and her bright purple backpack, her nervousness about flying evident in the way she gripped her stuffed elephant tightly against her chest. The scanner beeped to indicate a successful read of Zoe's boarding pass, but instead of the mechanical wave-through that her family members had received, Linda Hayes suddenly looked up from her computer screen and focused her attention on the 13-year-old girl standing before her. Something in the gate agent's expression changed a shift from bored professional routine to active scrutiny that immediately set off warning signals in David's mind. "Hold on a moment," Linda said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that was disproportionate to the situation at hand. David stopped his progress toward the jet bridge and turned back toward the boarding desk, his military training and federal law enforcement experience automatically activating when he sensed a problem developing. Angela also paused, her attorney's instincts telling her that something was about to go wrong. Linda Hayes leaned forward over her computer station and stared at Zoe's backpack with the kind of intense focus that suggested she had identified a serious problem requiring immediate attention. The bag was clearly designed for middle school students with sparkly decorative elements and a size that was obviously intended for books and school supplies rather than extensive travel gear. But Linda's expression suggested that she was looking at something that violated major airline policies. "That bag is too large," Linda announced, pointing at Zoe's backpack with the confident authority of someone who had made similar declarations countless times before. The statement hung in the air like an accusation, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who were still waiting in line and creating the kind of public spectacle that most travelers tried desperately to avoid. Zoe looked confused and frightened, glancing back at her parents for guidance, while clutching her stuffed elephant even more tightly. Tyler immediately stepped closer to his sister in a protective gesture that was instinctive for an older brother who had been taught to look out for family members. David's expression remained calm, but Angela could see the subtle tension in his posture that indicated he was preparing to handle a situation that was rapidly moving beyond normal passenger service issues. The purple backpack sat innocuously at Zoe's feet, clearly smaller than many of the personal items that other passengers were carrying onto the plane, and obviously designed for a child rather than an adult attempting to avoid baggage fees. The contrast between the gate agent's aggressive stance and the harmless nature of a 13-year-old's school backpack created an atmosphere of surreal tension that other passengers were beginning to notice and comment on quietly among themselves. Linda Hayes straightened behind her computer station with the kind of rigid posture that people adopt when they have decided to make a stand about something they know is questionable but feel compelled to defend anyway. Her eyes remained fixed on Zoe's purple backpack, as if it represented some kind of major security threat or policy violation that required immediate corporate intervention, despite the obvious fact that it was a child's school bag that was smaller than most airline-approved personal items. "Ma'am, that backpack exceeds our size limitations for personal items." Linda continued, her voice growing louder and more authoritative as she sensed the attention of other passengers and felt the need to justify her position publicly. "It's going to have to be checked, and there will be a $75 fee for that service payable immediately before boarding can continue." Angela Washington's legal training kicked into high gear as she heard what was clearly a violation of federal transportation regulations being presented as airline policy. She stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone who had spent years challenging incorrect legal interpretations in federal courtrooms, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that came from Harvard Law School and 15 years of successful civil rights litigation. "That's incorrect," Angela said clearly, ensuring that her voice would carry to the other passengers who were now watching the confrontation unfold. Federal aviation regulations specify that personal items must fit under the seat in front of the passenger, and that bag is obviously well within those dimensions. Additionally, there are specific protections for children's essential items during air travel that override general baggage policies. Linda's face flushed with embarrassment and anger as she realized that she was being challenged by someone who clearly knew more about airline regulations than she had expected. Her supervisor's warnings about fee collection echoed in her mind, mixing with 23 years of frustrated interactions with passengers who thought they knew better than airline employees, creating a toxic combination of professional desperation and personal pride that was about to explode. David Washington recognized the danger signs immediately, having dealt with similar power struggles during his military career and his work as a federal aviation inspector. He could see that the gate agent was operating under some kind of pressure that was causing her to make increasingly irrational decisions, and his experience told him that the situation was about to escalate beyond anything that could be resolved through normal customer service channels. "Let's just pay the fee," David said quietly, reaching for his wallet in an attempt to de-escalate the confrontation before it spiraled completely out of control. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had talked nervous pilots through emergency landings and knew that maintaining composure was essential when dealing with people under stress. Zoe looked up at her father with confusion and fear, not understanding why a simple school backpack was causing such a problem or why the gate agent was treating her like she had done something wrong. Tyler moved even closer to his sister, his teenage sense of justice outraged by what he could clearly see was an adult bullying a child for no legitimate reason. "Actually, it's too late for that," Linda said, her voice taking on a tone of vindictive satisfaction as she realized she had the power to punish this family for challenging her authority. "I'm closing the flight. You've been argumentative and disruptive, and I don't feel safe having you on board this aircraft." The words hit the gate area like a physical blow, causing other passengers to gasp audibly and step back from what was clearly becoming a serious confrontation. Linda's fingers moved rapidly across her computer keyboard as she began the process of removing the Washington family from the flight, manifest her expression showing a mixture of triumph and barely controlled panic as she realized she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "You're removing us from the flight?" David asked, his voice remaining calm but carrying an undertone that suggested he was beginning to consider options that the gate agent probably wouldn't appreciate. "Based on what specific regulation or policy violation?" "Based on you being aggressive and threatening." Linda replied, her voice rising to ensure that everyone in the gate area could hear her version of events. "I'm calling security to have you removed from the terminal. You people think you can just argue your way onto flights, but that's not how this works. The phrase 'you people' hung in the air like toxic gas. Its racial implications obvious to everyone within hearing distance and creating the kind of moment that would be replayed endlessly on social media and analyzed in corporate boardrooms." Angela's expression hardened as she recognized the discriminatory language that she had encountered countless times in her legal career, while David's jaw tightened as he realized that this confrontation had just moved into territory that would require the full weight of federal authority to resolve properly. The atmosphere in gate area D-15 transformed from routine boarding procedure to something approaching a public spectacle as Linda Hayes reached for the white courtesy phone that connected directly to airport security, her hand trembling slightly as she realized she was about to set in motion a series of events that would be very difficult to reverse. The other passengers in the boarding line had stopped their own conversations and were now watching the confrontation with the kind of horrified fascination that people display when witnessing a traffic accident. "Security to gate D-15, please?" Linda spoke into the phone, her voice carrying across the gate area with unmistakable authority. "I have an aggressive passenger situation that requires immediate assistance. The passengers are refusing to comply with airline policies and are creating a disturbance that's affecting other travelers." David Washington maintained his military bearing as he watched the gate agent fabricate a security incident out of thin air, his years of federal law enforcement training helping him recognize the critical importance of remaining calm and documenting everything that was happening. He could see several passengers using their smartphones to record the interaction, which would provide crucial evidence of what was actually occurring versus what Linda Hayes was reporting to security personnel. Angela stepped protectively closer to her children, while maintaining the professional composure that had served her well in countless courtroom situations where emotions ran high and clear. Thinking was essential. Zoe was now crying quietly, clutching her stuffed elephant and trying to understand why asking to board an airplane with her school backpack had turned into such a frightening situation. Tyler's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his teenage sense of justice outraged by watching his little sister being bullied by an adult who was supposed to be helping passengers. "Sir, I need you to step away from the podium immediately," Linda commanded, pointing an accusatory finger at David while other passengers muttered among themselves about what they were witnessing. "You're creating a hostile environment, and I won't tolerate that kind of behavior in my gate area." The phrase "my gate area" revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that was driving Linda's behavior. She had convinced herself that she possessed some kind of territorial authority over the space rather than understanding that she was an employee providing customer service to paying passengers who had every right to expect professional treatment regardless of their race or social status. Captain Mark Rivera emerged from the jet bridge where he had been conducting his pre-flight inspection of the aircraft, drawn by the commotion that was clearly audible even inside the airplane. As a pilot with 25 years of experience, flying everything from regional jets to wide-body international aircraft, Captain Rivera had seen every conceivable type of passenger disturbance. But what he observed at gate D-15 didn't match any pattern of legitimate security concerns he had encountered in his career. The captain approached the boarding desk with the calm professional demeanor that airline pilots cultivate as a way of projecting confidence and authority in situations where panic could be deadly, his eyes taking in the scene with the analytical precision of someone trained to assess complex situations quickly and accurately. What he saw was a well-dressed family standing quietly, while a gate agent appeared to be having some kind of emotional breakdown. "Linda, what's the situation here?" Captain Rivera asked, his voice carrying the kind of natural authority that comes from being responsible for the safety of hundreds of passengers on a regular basis. He could see that David Washington was standing calmly with his hands visible, and his family gathered close around him, which didn't match Linda's description of an aggressive passenger creating a security threat. This passenger became hostile when I told him his daughter's bag was too large, Linda replied, her voice becoming more shrill as she sensed that the captain might not automatically support her version of events. He refused to pay the baggage fee and then became threatening when I explained our policies. I've called security because I don't feel safe with him on the aircraft. Captain Rivera looked at Zoe's purple backpack, which was sitting innocuously on the floor and was obviously smaller than dozens of personal items he saw passengers carry onto flights every single day. His expression remained neutral, but his years of experience had taught him to recognize when someone was lying about what had actually happened during a passenger interaction. The sound of heavy footsteps announced the arrival of 2 airport security officers and a Chicago Police Department officer, their presence immediately raising the stakes of what had been a customer service dispute into something that could result in arrests, criminal charges, and the kind of life-altering consequences that happen when racial bias intersects with law enforcement authority. Officer Patricia Kowalski, a veteran of the Chicago Police Department with 15 years of experience handling airport disputes, approached the scene with the cautious professionalism of someone who understood that airport incidents often involved complicated jurisdictional issues and high emotions that could escalate rapidly if not managed properly. "Ma'am, what's the nature of the problem?" Officer Kowalski asked Linda while keeping her eyes on David Washington and assessing whether he presented any legitimate threat that would require immediate intervention. What she observed was a middle-aged black man in business casual clothing standing next to what appeared to be his wife and 2 children, none of whom were exhibiting any signs of aggressive or threatening behavior. This man became violent when I told him about our baggage policy, Linda said, her voice now carrying a tone of theatrical victimization that was clearly intended to generate sympathy from the arriving officers. He lunged toward me and made threats about what would happen if I didn't let his family on the plane. I'm afraid for my safety, and I think he might have a weapon. The accusation of threatened violence and possible weapons possession transformed the atmosphere immediately, causing the police officer to place her hand on her holster, while the security officers moved to positions that would allow them to respond quickly if the situation escalated further. Other passengers in the gate area began backing away from what they now perceived as a potentially dangerous situation. Officer Kowalski's training and experience told her to take any report of threatened violence seriously, especially in an airport environment where security concerns carried federal implications and the potential for mass casualties. But her observations of the Washington family didn't match the behavior pattern that Linda Hayes was describing. The disconnect between the gate agent's dramatic accusations and the calm demeanor of the accused passengers created the kind of cognitive dissonance that experienced law enforcement officers learn to recognize as a red flag. "Sir, I need you to place your hands where I can see them and take a step back from the counter," Officer Kowalski instructed David, her voice carrying official authority, but lacking the aggressive tone that might escalate an already tense situation. David complied immediately, raising his hands with palms open and taking 2 deliberate steps backward while maintaining eye contact with the officer in a way that demonstrated cooperation without submission. "Officer, I am completely unarmed and have been standing here calmly with my family while this gate agent has escalated a simple carry-on bag question into false accusations of violence," David said, his voice carrying the kind of clear articulation that suggested military or law enforcement training. There are multiple witnesses who can verify that nothing this employee has claimed actually occurred. Angela Washington stepped forward with the controlled urgency of someone whose legal training had taught her to recognize when civil rights violations were occurring in real time, her mind already cataloging the various federal statutes that were being violated by the false accusations and discriminatory treatment her family was experiencing. Officer, I am Angela Washington, a federal public defender, and I need to inform you that this gate agent has filed what appears to be a false police report. Angela said, her voice carrying the professional authority of someone who had spent years navigating the intersection of civil rights law and criminal justice procedures. My husband has not threatened anyone, has not made any aggressive movements, and has repeatedly offered to comply with airline policies even when those policies were being incorrectly applied. Linda Hayes realized that the situation was beginning to slip away from her control as other passengers began speaking up to contradict her version of events, their voices creating a chorus of witness testimony that directly challenged her accusations of aggressive behavior and threatened violence. I recorded the whole thing, called out a young woman holding her smartphone. He never moved toward her, never raised his voice, and definitely never threatened anyone. She's the one who's been yelling and making accusations. Same here, added a businessman in a navy suit. I've been standing right here the whole time, and that man has been nothing but polite. The gate agent is completely fabricating what happened. Officer Kowalski found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between supporting the official complaint of an airline employee and the contradictory testimony of multiple civilian witnesses, all while dealing with the growing awareness that this incident was being recorded by numerous passengers and would likely end up on social media, regardless of how she handled the situation. David Washington reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and visible to ensure that the armed police officer would not misinterpret his actions as threatening, and withdrew a black leather wallet that he held up for Officer Kowalski to see before opening it to reveal its contents. Officer, before this goes any further, I think you should know exactly who you're dealing with. David, said his voice remaining calm but taking on an undertone of authority that hadn't been present before. I am Dr. David Washington, Senior Aviation Safety Inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration, and this incident is rapidly becoming a federal civil rights violation that will require investigation by multiple agencies. The revelation hit the gate area like a thunderclap, causing Linda Hayes to step backward from her computer station as if she had been physically struck. Officer Kowalski examined the federal identification badge and credentials with the careful attention of someone who understood that mishandling a federal official could end her career, while Captain Rivera moved closer to get a better look at what was clearly a legitimate government identification. Dr. Washington, I apologize for the confusion, Officer Kowalski said, her tone immediately shifting from law enforcement authority to professional deference. Can you help me understand what actually happened here so we can resolve this situation appropriately? Linda Hayes watched her version of events crumble in real time as she realized that she had accused a high-ranking federal aviation official of threatening violence and possessing weapons accusations that could be easily disproven by multiple witnesses and video recordings. The magnitude of her mistake was beginning to dawn on her, but her desperation and pride prevented her from backing down gracefully. I don't care who he says he is, Linda declared, her voice taking on a hysterical edge as she sensed that her authority was evaporating. He was aggressive, and I felt threatened. And that's all that matters. Federal employee or not, he doesn't get to intimidate gate agents and expect special treatment. Captain Rivera, who had been quietly observing the interaction while mentally reviewing his knowledge of federal aviation regulations and airline industry protocols, stepped forward with the kind of professional concern that airline pilots develop when they realize that their flight operations might be compromised by factors beyond their control. Dr. Washington, I'm familiar with your work on runway safety protocols. Captain Rivera said, his voice carrying the respect that one aviation professional shows another. Your recommendations on approach lighting systems were incorporated into our standard operating procedures last year. What exactly has happened here that's caused this situation? The captain's recognition of David's professional reputation created another crack in Linda's fabricated narrative as it became increasingly clear that she had targeted someone whose authority in aviation matters far exceeded her own, and whose federal position gave him the power to investigate exactly the kind of discrimination and policy violations she had been committing. David Washington stood in the gate area of O'Hare International Airport, surrounded by dozens of witnesses, armed police officers, and airline personnel, while making the most consequential phone call of his 20-year career with the Federal Aviation Administration. His finger hovered over a contact entry in his phone that he had never expected to use for personal reasons. FAA Regional Administrator, Dr. Patricia Chen, direct line. The phone rang twice before Dr. Chen's voice came through with the crisp professionalism of someone accustomed to handling aviation emergencies at any hour of the day or night. Her tone immediately shifting from routine business to serious concern when she recognized David's voice and heard the background noise of an active airport gate area. David. "What's your situation?" Dr. Chen asked her decades of experience in aviation safety management, allowing her to recognize that this was not a casual call from one of her most trusted senior inspectors. David could hear her moving away from whatever meeting or dinner she had been attending, the background noise fading as she found a private space to focus on what was clearly an urgent federal matter. "Patricia, I'm at O'Hare Gate D15 with my family, and I've just been accused of making terrorist threats by a Prestige Airways gate agent who appears to be engaged in racial profiling and willful violation of federal transportation regulations," David said, his voice carrying the calm precision of someone who had learned to communicate critical information accurately under pressure. "I'm going to need immediate federal intervention to prevent this situation from escalating further." Dr. Chen's response was immediate and decisive, reflecting her understanding that any incident involving racial discrimination against federal employees in airport settings carried implications that extended far beyond individual customer service problems and into the realm of civil rights law, federal oversight responsibilities, and potential criminal violations. "David, are you and your family safe at this moment, Doctor?" Chen asked, her voice taking on the urgent tone of someone who was already mentally organizing the federal response that would be necessary to address what was clearly a serious incident. "Do you need immediate assistance from federal law enforcement, or can you maintain the situation until we can deploy appropriate resources?" "We're physically safe, but the local police have been called based on false accusations of violence and weapon possession," David replied, his eyes never leaving Officer Kowalski's face as he spoke. "I need you to contact the Chicago Police Department immediately to verify my federal status and credentials, and then I need you to initiate an emergency safety audit of Prestige Airways gate operations effective immediately." The phrase emergency safety audit carried weight in aviation circles that extended far beyond routine regulatory compliance checks, representing the kind of federal intervention that airlines feared most because it could result in operational shutdowns, massive financial penalties, and the kind of negative publicity that destroyed corporate reputations and shareholder value overnight. Linda Hayes, who had been listening to David's phone conversation from behind her computer station, finally understood that she had made an error that would have consequences far beyond anything she had experienced during her 23-year career with Prestige Airways. The color drained from her face as she realized that the man she had accused of being a disruptive passenger was actually a federal official with the authority to ground airline operations and initiate investigations that could destroy her career and possibly result in criminal charges. "Dr. Chen, I'm invoking Federal Safety Oversight Authority under 14 CFR, Part 5 to suspend Prestige Airways flight operations in the Great Lakes region pending investigation of discriminatory practices and crew resource management failures," David continued, his voice carrying the kind of official authority that made Captain Rivera step closer to better understand what was happening to his airline. Dr. Chen's response came without hesitation, reflecting her understanding that David Washington was not someone who would invoke federal emergency powers lightly or without serious justification, and that his reputation for professional judgment and ethical behavior made his assessment of the situation worthy of immediate and comprehensive federal action. Consider it done, David. I'm issuing the ground stop order immediately, and I'm dispatching a federal investigation team to O'Hare within the hour, Doctor. Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority backed by decades of aviation safety experience. I'm also contacting the Department of Transportation Office of Inspector General to initiate a civil rights investigation based on what you've described. The immediate impact of Dr. Chen's decision began manifesting within minutes as air traffic control towers throughout the Midwest received federal orders to ground all Prestige Airways aircraft, preventing takeoffs and directing planes already in the air to land at their nearest suitable airports. The airline's operations center in Dallas erupted in controlled panic as flight dispatchers tried to understand why their entire regional fleet had suddenly been ordered out of the sky. Officer Kowalski, who had been listening to David's phone conversation with growing amazement and concern, approached him with the kind of professional respect that law enforcement officers show to federal officials whose authority supersedes local jurisdiction in matters involving interstate commerce and civil rights violations. Dr. Washington, I need to understand exactly what my role should be in this situation. Officer Kowalski said, her voice reflecting her awareness that she was now involved in something that could affect her own career and the reputation of the Chicago Police Department. Are there federal charges that need to be filed, or should I be coordinating with other agencies about how to proceed? David ended his call with Dr. Chen and turned his attention to the police officer with the kind of measured professionalism that characterized his approach to all aviation safety matters. Understanding that proper coordination between federal and local authorities would be essential to ensuring that justice was served appropriately and that similar incidents could be prevented in the future. The electronic displays throughout O'Hare International Airport began flickering with updates that told the story of an airline in crisis as Prestige Airways flight numbers disappeared from departure boards and were replaced with the dreaded word "canceled" in red letters that seemed to glow with accusatory intensity. Gate agents throughout Terminal 2 stared at their computer screens in disbelief as the airline's reservation system locked down and prevented any new bookings or flight modifications. In the Network Operations Center of Prestige Airways headquarters in Dallas, Texas, a room that normally hummed with the quiet efficiency of commercial aviation logistics suddenly erupted in alarm bells and flashing warning lights as flight dispatchers realized that their entire Midwest operation had been suspended by federal order. Senior Vice President of Operations Michael Rodriguez abandoned his lunch meeting and ran to the control room where wall-mounted displays showed a growing sea of red symbols indicating grounded aircraft across 7 states. What in God's name is happening to our operation? Rodriguez shouted over the cacophony of ringing phones and urgent conversations as his operations team tried to determine whether they were dealing with a security threat, a system failure, or some other catastrophe that could shut down a major airline on a weekday afternoon. Sir, we're getting reports from ATC that the FAA has issued an emergency safety directive grounding all Prestige Airways operations in the Great Lakes region, replied Sarah Kim, the duty manager, whose voice carried the strain of someone delivering news that would likely end careers and cost millions of dollars. The order came directly from the regional administrator's office, and it's being enforced by federal air traffic controllers. Rodriguez felt his blood pressure spike as he realized that whatever had triggered this federal response was serious enough to justify the most severe regulatory action available to the FAA, an emergency grounding that would cost the airline approximately $12 million per hour and destroy their reputation with business travelers who demanded reliable schedules. Meanwhile, back at Gate D15, Linda Hayes watched her professional life disintegrate in real time as passengers pulled out their smartphones to record her interaction with federal law enforcement and share their footage on social media platforms where viral content about airline discrimination could generate millions of views within hours. Captain Rivera received an urgent message on his company-issued phone directing him to shut down his engines and return to the gate immediately, the terse language of the communication leaving no doubt that this was not a routine operational adjustment, but rather an emergency situation that required immediate compliance with federal authorities. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been directed to suspend our departure preparations due to an ongoing federal investigation, Captain Rivera announced to the passengers who had already boarded his aircraft, his professional tone masking his concern about what this incident would mean for his own career and the airline he had served faithfully for 15 years. Officer Kowalski, meanwhile, had called for additional backup after confirming David Washington's federal credentials through her department's liaison with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, understanding that any case involving civil rights violations against federal employees would require careful documentation and coordination with multiple agencies. The social media response began within minutes of the first passenger videos being uploaded to platforms like Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, where hashtags like #PrestigeAirwaysGrounded and #AirportDiscrimination began trending as users shared the footage and demanded accountability from the airline and the airport authority. Tyler Washington, despite his parents' instructions to stay calm and quiet during the official investigation, couldn't resist checking his own social media feeds, and was amazed to discover that videos of his family's confrontation with Linda Hayes had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times and were being shared by civil rights organizations, aviation industry analysts, and ordinary travelers who had experienced similar discrimination. Angela Washington, drawing on her experience as a federal public defender, began documenting the incident with the meticulous attention to detail that would be necessary for any subsequent civil rights lawsuit or federal prosecution. Photographing Linda Hayes's badge number, recording the names and contact information of willing witnesses, and noting the exact sequence of events that had led to false accusations of violence and terrorism. Linda Hayes found herself isolated behind her gate podium as her supervisor Marcus Webb arrived with airport security personnel and a representative from Prestige Airways corporate headquarters, all of whom were trying to understand how a routine baggage dispute had escalated into a federal investigation that was costing the company millions of dollars per minute. The airline's stock price, which had been trading normally when the markets opened that morning, began plummeting as news of the federal grounding spread to investors and financial analysts who understood that regulatory sanctions against major airlines could indicate serious underlying problems with corporate culture and operational procedures. Dr. Patricia Chen's federal investigation team was already en route to O'Hare, aboard a government aircraft carrying the kind of comprehensive authority that would allow them to review internal airline documents, interview employees, and determine whether the incident represented an isolated case of poor judgment or evidence of widespread discriminatory practices that required federal intervention. The transformation of a family vacation into a federal civil rights case would ultimately expose the difference between the power that employees think they possess and the authority that federal oversight actually represents when corporate policies conflict with civil rights law and professional accountability. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in Chicago received notification of the Prestige Airways incident within 2 hours of David Washington's initial call to Dr. Patricia Chen, setting in motion the kind of comprehensive civil rights investigation that could result in federal criminal charges, massive corporate fines, and the restructuring of an entire airline's operational procedures. Special Agent Maria Santos, a veteran of the FBI's Civil Rights Division with 15 years of experience investigating discrimination cases in transportation industries, arrived at O'Hare International Airport with a team of federal investigators who possessed the authority to seize corporate records, interview witnesses under oath, and determine whether Linda Hayes's actions represented criminal violations of federal civil rights statutes. The investigation began with witness interviews conducted in a private conference room provided by the airport authority, where passengers who had recorded the incident on their smartphones provided statements that would become crucial evidence in any potential prosecution. The consistency of their testimony painted a clear picture of racial discrimination disguised as policy enforcement, with multiple witnesses describing Linda Hayes using coded language and applying different standards to the Washington family than to other passengers. Agent Santos discovered that Linda Hayes' employment record with Prestige Airways contained 3 previous complaints about discriminatory behavior toward minority passengers, all of which had been dismissed by the airline's Human Resources Department without adequate investigation or remedial action. The pattern of complaints, combined with the company's failure to address them appropriately, suggested that the Washington incident was not an isolated case, but rather the culmination of ongoing discriminatory practices that the airline had chosen to ignore. The federal investigation expanded beyond the individual actions of Linda Hayes to examine Prestige Airways' corporate culture and training procedures, particularly the performance pressure that gate agents faced, to generate additional revenue through baggage fees and upgrade sales. Internal company emails revealed that employees were threatened with termination if they failed to meet specific quotas for additional charges, creating an environment where discrimination could be rationalized as business necessity. Dr. David Washington, despite his personal involvement in the incident, was asked to provide technical expertise for the investigation due to his extensive knowledge of federal aviation regulations and civil rights law as it applied to commercial airline operations. His analysis revealed that Prestige Airways had violated at least 7 different federal statutes, ranging from civil rights violations to false reporting of security threats. The Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General launched a parallel investigation focused on whether Prestige Airways policies and training procedures violated federal regulations, requiring equal treatment of all passengers, regardless of race, ethnicity, or social status. Their review of company documents revealed a troubling pattern of complaints that had been systematically dismissed without proper investigation. Angela Washington's experience as a federal public defender proved invaluable in documenting the legal aspects of the case, as she understood exactly which federal statutes had been violated and how to preserve evidence that would be necessary for potential criminal prosecution. Her detailed timeline of events, combined with witness statements and video evidence, created an unassailable record of what had actually occurred versus what Linda Hayes had reported to law enforcement. The investigation also revealed that Prestige Airways corporate executives had been aware of discrimination complaints against multiple employees but had failed to implement adequate training or oversight procedures to prevent similar incidents. Internal memos showed that the company had calculated that paying occasional discrimination settlements was less expensive than implementing comprehensive civil rights compliance programs. Congressional representatives who served on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee announced plans for hearings on discrimination in the airline industry, using the Washington case as an example of how inadequate federal oversight had allowed discriminatory practices to flourish in commercial aviation. The political pressure created by media coverage of the incident forced federal agencies to take stronger action than might have been pursued in less public circumstances. The financial impact on Prestige Airways continued to mount as the federal grounding of their Midwest operations extended beyond the initial emergency order, with regulators requiring comprehensive reviews of gate agent training, supervisory oversight, and corporate policies before allowing normal operations to resume. The airline's stock price continued falling as investors realized that the regulatory sanctions could extend for weeks or months while the investigation continued. Linda Hayes sat in the sterile holding room of the Cook County Federal Detention Center, her airline uniform replaced by orange jail scrubs that marked her transformation from authority figure to federal defendant facing charges that could result in decades in prison. The reality of her situation was beginning to penetrate the fog of denial and rationalization that had sustained her through the initial arrest and booking process. The federal charges filed against Linda were comprehensive and serious deprivation of rights under color of law, false reporting of terrorist threats, interfering with federal officers in the performance of their duties, and conspiracy to commit civil rights violations. Each charge carried potential prison sentences that, when combined, could result in Linda spending the rest of her working life in federal custody. Her court-appointed attorney, Robert Martinez, had reviewed the evidence against his client and delivered the kind of bleak assessment that public defenders learn to communicate with compassionate honesty to defendants whose cases appear hopeless. The video evidence witness testimony and federal credentials of the victims created a prosecution case that would be virtually impossible to challenge successfully at trial. Linda: I need you to understand that the federal prosecutors have enough evidence to convict you on all charges, Martinez explained during their initial consultation in the federal detention facility. Your best option is to cooperate fully with the investigation and hope that your assistance in exposing broader problems at Prestige Airways might result in a reduced sentence. The psychological impact of her situation was compounded by the social media coverage that had made Linda Hayes a symbol of everything wrong with airline customer service and racial discrimination in commercial aviation. Her photograph taken from her employee badge had been shared millions of times, alongside video footage of her confrontation with the Washington family, creating a permanent digital record of her worst professional moment. Linda's family relationships, already strained by her recent divorce and financial problems, deteriorated further as relatives distanced themselves from the negative publicity surrounding her federal charges. Her ex-husband used the criminal case to seek custody modifications for their teenage daughter, arguing that Linda's legal problems made her an unfit parent. The loss of her airline pension and benefits, which had been her only source of financial security for retirement, left Linda facing the prospect of poverty, even if she managed to avoid lengthy prison sentences. Prestige Airways had terminated her employment immediately after her arrest, forfeiting all accumulated benefits and leaving her responsible for her own legal expenses in both criminal and civil proceedings. Meanwhile, the Washington family was processing their own complex emotions about the incident and its aftermath, trying to balance their satisfaction with the federal response against their recognition that Linda Hayes was ultimately a victim of corporate policies that had encouraged discriminatory behavior through quota pressure and inadequate training. Zoe Washington, despite her parents' efforts to shield her from the most disturbing aspects of the investigation, was struggling with nightmares and anxiety about air travel that required professional counseling to address. The 13-year-old had difficulty understanding why an adult had targeted her with such hostility, and her innocence had been damaged in ways that would require time and therapy to heal. Tyler Washington, on the other hand, had been energized by witnessing his father's successful response to injustice and had begun researching civil rights law and federal law enforcement as potential career paths. His experience seeing his family targeted for discrimination had crystallized his sense of social justice and his determination to fight against prejudice and abuse of authority. David Washington found himself conflicted about the severity of the consequences that Linda Hayes was facing, understanding that her actions had been influenced by corporate pressure and inadequate training, while also recognizing that civil rights violations required serious punishment to deter similar behavior by other employees throughout the airline industry. Angela Washington channeled her anger about the incident into expanded civil rights work, taking on additional cases involving transportation discrimination and working with advocacy organizations to push for stronger federal oversight of airline industry practices. Her experience as a victim of discrimination had given her new insight into the emotional impact of civil rights violations on families and children. The federal investigation had also revealed that Linda Hayes had been struggling with untreated depression and anxiety that had been exacerbated by her divorce, financial problems, and job pressure, creating a complex picture of personal responsibility intersecting with corporate negligence and inadequate mental health support for employees in high-stress customer service positions. The boardroom of Prestige Airways corporate headquarters in Dallas resembled a war zone as executives, lawyers, and crisis management consultants worked around the clock to prevent the Linda Hayes incident from destroying a company that had taken decades to build and employed thousands of people across the country. The mahogany conference table was covered with financial reports, legal briefs, and media monitoring summaries that painted a picture of corporate catastrophe unfolding in real time. CEO Jonathan Pierce, whose 20-year career had been built on cost-cutting measures and profit maximization, found himself facing the kind of crisis that could not be resolved through layoffs or service reductions, but required fundamental changes to corporate culture and operational procedures that would cost millions of dollars and reduce short-term profitability. The Department of Transportation's investigation had revealed a pattern of discrimination complaints that Prestige Airways had systematically ignored or minimized with internal emails, showing that corporate executives had calculated that paying occasional settlements was less expensive than implementing comprehensive civil rights training and oversight programs. The federal investigators' access to these communications had created an unassailable case for corporate liability. Ladies and gentlemen, we're looking at potential federal fines in excess of $65 million, plus unlimited civil liability for discrimination. Claims that could be filed by every passenger who has ever been mistreated by our employees, announced General Counsel Patricia Rodriguez, whose legal team had been working 20-hour days to assess the company's exposure to federal prosecution and civil lawsuits. The airline's stock price had fallen by more than 40% since the incident at O'Hare, wiping out billions of dollars in shareholder value and triggering margin calls that forced institutional investors to sell their positions at devastating losses. Credit rating agencies had downgraded Prestige Airways' debt to junk status, making it nearly impossible for the company to secure financing for normal operations. The Federal Aviation Administration had extended the grounding of Prestige Airways' Midwest operations pending completion of a comprehensive audit that would examine every aspect of the company's customer service, training, employee supervision, and complaint resolution procedures. The audit process was expected to take months and could result in additional operational restrictions that would further damage the airline's financial position. Labor unions representing Prestige Airways employees had filed grievances challenging the quota system that had pressured gate agents to generate additional revenue through questionable fees and charges, arguing that the company had created working conditions that virtually guaranteed discriminatory treatment of passengers. The union actions had been supported by civil rights organizations and congressional representatives who demanded industry-wide reforms. CEO Pierce found himself personally named in multiple federal investigations, including a Securities and Exchange Commission inquiry into whether the company had adequately disclosed its legal risks to investors and a Department of Justice investigation into whether corporate executives had knowingly maintained policies that violated federal civil rights laws. The crisis management consultants hired by Prestige Airways had recommended a complete restructuring of the company's leadership team, including the immediate resignation of Pierce and other senior executives whose emails had revealed awareness of discrimination problems without adequate remedial action. The board of directors faced their own potential legal liability for failing to exercise proper oversight of corporate policies and employee behavior. Insurance companies that had provided coverage for discrimination claims were threatening to cancel their policies, with Prestige Airways arguing that the company had failed to maintain adequate training and oversight procedures required under their insurance contracts. The loss of coverage would leave the airline personally liable for all future discrimination settlements and judgments. Congressional representatives had announced plans for comprehensive hearings on discrimination in the airline industry, using the Prestige Airways case as an example of how inadequate federal oversight had allowed discriminatory practices to flourish throughout commercial aviation. The political pressure created by media coverage was forcing regulatory agencies to consider industry-wide reforms that could affect all airlines. The company's attempts to minimize the incident through public relations campaigns had backfired spectacularly as civil rights organizations and social media influencers highlighted the contrast between corporate statements about diversity and inclusion and the actual treatment received by the Washington family at O'Hare Airport. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago became the focal point of national attention as the criminal trial of Linda Hayes began with media coverage that extended far beyond typical airline industry news into broader discussions about racial discrimination, corporate accountability, and federal civil rights enforcement in commercial transportation. United States District Judge Helen Martinez presided over the trial with the kind of methodical precision that federal judges develop when handling cases that involve complex civil rights issues and extensive media attention. Understanding that her rulings would be scrutinized by appellate courts and cited in future discrimination cases throughout the federal system. The prosecution team, led by Assistant United States Attorney Michael Chang, presented a case that was devastating in its simplicity and supported by video evidence that made Linda Hayes' guilt obvious to anyone who watched the recorded interactions between her and the Washington family at Gate D-15 of O'Hare International Airport. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the abuse of authority and the weaponization of law enforcement against an innocent family whose only crime was traveling. While Black Chang said in his opening statement his words carrying the weight of federal civil rights law and decades of legal precedent establishing that discrimination in transportation was a serious federal offense. Linda Hayes' defense attorney, Robert Martinez, faced the nearly impossible task of arguing that his client's actions had been motivated by legitimate policy concerns rather than racial discrimination, despite video evidence showing her applying different standards to the Washington family than to other passengers, and using coded language that clearly revealed her prejudicial assumptions. The trial testimony included devastating evidence from former Prestige Airways employees who described the quota pressure that had encouraged discriminatory enforcement of baggage policies, with gate agents specifically instructed to target passengers who appeared unlikely to challenge additional fees or who could be intimidated into compliance through aggressive customer service tactics. Dr. David Washington's testimony was particularly powerful as he described the impact of the incident on his children, particularly his daughter Zoe, who had required counseling to address the trauma of being targeted by an adult authority figure for discrimination that she was too young to understand but old enough to internalize as a personal attack on her worth and dignity. Angela Washington's legal expertise allowed her to provide testimony that explained the various federal statutes that Linda Hayes had violated, helping the jury understand that this was not simply a case of poor customer service, but rather a series of federal crimes that struck at the heart of civil rights protections that had been established through decades of struggle and sacrifice. The prosecution presented evidence showing that Linda Hayes had filed false reports, claiming that David Washington had made terrorist threats and behaved aggressively, accusations that were directly contradicted by video evidence and witness testimony that showed the federal inspector maintaining calm professionalism throughout the confrontation. Witness testimony from other passengers who had been present during the incident provided a clear timeline of events that established Linda Hayes as the aggressor in the confrontation, using her position of authority to escalate a minor policy question into a major civil rights violation through false accusations and discriminatory enforcement of airline regulations. The defense's attempts to portray Linda Hayes as a victim of corporate pressure fell flat when prosecutors presented evidence showing that other Prestige Airways employees working under similar conditions had managed to avoid discriminating against passengers or filing false police reports, demonstrating that individual choice and personal prejudice had driven her actions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges against Linda Hayes, including deprivation of rights under color of law, false reporting of terrorist threats, and interfering with federal officers in the performance of their duties. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the clarity of the legal standards that had been violated. Judge Martinez scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, during which time federal probation officers would prepare a comprehensive report examining Linda Hayes' background, the impact of her actions on the victims, and the appropriate punishment for civil rights violations that had been committed in such a public and damaging manner. The federal courthouse steps became a stage for civil rights advocates and media representatives who recognized that the Linda Hayes conviction represented more than individual accountability, but rather a watershed moment in the fight against discrimination in commercial aviation, with implications that would extend throughout the transportation industry and into corporate boardrooms across America. Angela Washington addressed the gathered crowd with the poise and authority that had made her successful as a federal public defender. Her words carrying the weight of someone who had experienced discrimination personally and understood its broader implications for civil rights enforcement in an era when federal protections were constantly under attack by corporate interests. This conviction sends a clear message that federal civil rights laws will be enforced and that employees who abuse their authority to discriminate against passengers will face serious consequences. Angela said, her voice carrying across the courthouse plaza where supporters had gathered to celebrate the jury's verdict. But individual accountability is only the first step in creating the changes necessary to ensure that all travelers are treated with dignity and respect. David Washington, speaking briefly to reporters, emphasized that the case had always been about protecting other families from experiencing the kind of discrimination and false accusations that his children had witnessed, understanding that his federal position had given him resources and authority that were not available to most passengers who faced similar treatment from airline employees. The media coverage of the conviction extended beyond typical crime reporting to include analysis of broader issues related to racial discrimination in transportation, corporate liability for employee actions, and the effectiveness of federal civil rights enforcement in industries that served millions of customers daily across the country. Zoe Washington, now 14 and still processing the trauma of being targeted for discrimination, had been shielded from most of the trial proceedings, but understood that the adult who had treated her cruelly was being held accountable for her actions. Her parents' decision to pursue federal prosecution had been motivated partly by their desire to show their daughter that injustice could be challenged successfully when people were willing to stand up for what was right. Tyler Washington, who had witnessed his father's calm and effective response to discrimination, had been accepted to several prestigious universities with plans to study civil rights law and federal law enforcement. Understanding that his family's experience had shown him both the reality of ongoing discrimination and the possibility of fighting back effectively against prejudice and abuse of authority. The broader impact of the conviction extended beyond the Washington family to include policy changes throughout the airline industry, as companies recognized that federal prosecutors were willing to pursue criminal charges against employees who violated civil rights laws, and that corporate policies encouraging discriminatory behavior could result in massive financial and legal consequences. Prestige Airways had been forced to implement comprehensive changes to their training programs, customer service policies, and employee oversight procedures as part of a federal consent decree that would require ongoing monitoring by civil rights organizations and federal agencies for the next 5 years. The cost of these changes, combined with federal fines and civil settlements, had exceeded $100 million. Linda Hayes faced federal sentencing in 6 weeks, during which time her attorney would present mitigating evidence about her personal circumstances, while prosecutors prepared to argue that her actions had been so egregious and damaging that significant prison time was necessary to deter similar behavior by other airline employees throughout the country. The conviction had also triggered congressional hearings on discrimination in transportation that would examine whether current federal oversight was adequate to prevent similar incidents and whether additional legislation was necessary to ensure equal treatment for all passengers, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, or social status. 6 months after the federal conviction of Linda Hayes, the transformation of Prestige Airways from a company that had tolerated discrimination into an industry leader in civil rights compliance represented one of the most comprehensive corporate culture changes in modern aviation history, driven by federal oversight and the recognition that discriminatory practices were both morally wrong and financially devastating. The airline's new chief executive officer, Maria Santos, had been recruited from a civil rights organization specifically because of her expertise in implementing diversity and inclusion programs that went beyond corporate public relations to create meaningful changes in employee behavior and customer service policies. Her appointment had been mandated by the federal consent decree that governed the company's operations. Dr. David Washington had been promoted to Director of National Aviation Civil Rights Enforcement, a newly created position within the Federal Aviation Administration that gave him authority to investigate discrimination complaints throughout the airline industry and implement training programs designed to prevent the kind of civil rights violations that had occurred at O'Hare Airport. The new federal position allowed David to travel throughout the country, conducting surprise audits of airline operations, interviewing passengers and employees, and ensuring that the reforms implemented at Prestige Airways were being adopted voluntarily by other carriers who wanted to avoid similar federal intervention in their own operations. Angela Washington had expanded her civil rights law practice to focus specifically on transportation discrimination cases, working with advocacy organizations to identify passengers who had experienced mistreatment and pursuing both individual justice and policy changes that would benefit all travelers. Her expertise and credibility as someone who had successfully challenged airline discrimination made her a sought-after advocate for civil rights enforcement. The Washington children had also been transformed by their experience with discrimination and federal law enforcement, with both Zoe and Tyler developing a deeper understanding of civil rights issues and their own responsibilities to challenge injustice when they encountered it in their daily lives. Zoe, now confident in her knowledge that discrimination could be successfully challenged, had become an advocate for other young people who experienced prejudice, speaking at middle school assemblies about the importance of reporting unfair treatment and understanding that civil rights protections existed to protect everyone, regardless of their age or social status. Tyler had been accepted to Howard University's pre-law program with plans to specialize in federal civil rights enforcement, inspired by watching his father use federal authority to protect not just their family, but all passengers who might face similar discrimination in the future. His college application essay about witnessing effective resistance to prejudice had been praised by admissions officers as an example of how personal experience could inspire broader social commitment. Linda Hayes had served 18 months of her 3-year federal sentence before being released on supervised probation, during which time she had participated in counseling programs designed to help her understand the impact of racial bias and develop skills for challenging her own prejudicial assumptions. Her early release had been contingent on her agreement to work with civil rights organizations in training airline employees about the consequences of discrimination. The work that Linda was required to perform as part of her probation involved traveling to airports throughout the country to share her experience with gate agents, customer service representatives, and supervisors, explaining how unconscious bias and corporate pressure had led her to make decisions that destroyed her career and resulted in federal criminal charges. Her presentations to airline employees were powerful because of her authenticity as someone who had experienced the full consequences of discriminatory behavior, and her willingness to accept responsibility for her actions had made her an effective advocate for civil rights training that went beyond legal compliance to address the underlying attitudes that enabled discrimination to flourish. The federal oversight of Prestige Airways had also revealed that discrimination problems extended throughout the airline industry, leading to congressional legislation requiring all carriers to implement comprehensive civil rights training and establish independent monitoring systems that would identify and address prejudicial treatment before it escalated into federal violations. The broader impact of the Washington case had transformed not just one airline, but the entire industry's approach to customer service, employee training, and civil rights compliance, demonstrating that effective federal enforcement could create positive changes that protected the rights and dignity of millions of travelers. 1 year after the incident that had transformed their understanding of both discrimination and justice, the Washington family found themselves back at O'Hare International Airport. But this time, their experience represented everything that air travel could and should be when federal civil rights laws were properly enforced and airline employees were adequately trained to treat all passengers with dignity and respect. The same Terminal 2 that had been the site of their traumatic confrontation with Linda Hayes now showcased the kind of customer service that was possible when corporations prioritized civil rights compliance over short-term profit maximization and employee pressure to generate questionable fees through discriminatory enforcement of airline policies. Maria Santos, the new gate agent working at Position D-15, greeted the Washington family with the kind of professional warmth that represented everything Linda Hayes had failed to provide her training in civil rights awareness and customer service excellence, evident in every interaction with passengers, regardless of their race, age, or social status. Dr. and Mrs. Washington, welcome back to Prestige Airways, Maria said, her genuine smile reflecting the comprehensive cultural changes that had transformed the airline from a company that tolerated discrimination into an industry leader in civil rights compliance and customer service excellence. We're honored to have you flying with us today, and I want to ensure that your experience exceeds your expectations in every way. The boarding process proceeded smoothly and efficiently, with Maria demonstrating the kind of respectful professionalism that should characterize all airline employee interactions, but had become increasingly rare in an industry that had prioritized cost-cutting over customer service for decades. Zoe's backpack, the same purple bag that had triggered the original confrontation, was processed without any questions or additional fees. David Washington observed the improved procedures and employee attitudes with the satisfaction of someone whose federal oversight work was producing measurable improvements in civil rights compliance throughout the airline industry, knowing that his family's traumatic experience had ultimately protected countless other passengers from facing similar discrimination. The flight to Atlanta proceeded without incident, but the Washington family's journey had been transformed from a simple vacation trip into a powerful symbol of how individual courage in confronting injustice could create changes that benefited entire communities of travelers who had previously accepted discriminatory treatment as an unavoidable aspect of commercial aviation. Captain Jennifer Rodriguez, who had replaced the previous pilot on this route, made a point of personally welcoming the Washington family aboard and expressing her appreciation for their role in creating the policy changes that had made Prestige Airways a better company for both employees and passengers. Her gesture represented the kind of corporate leadership that prioritized civil rights over profit maximization. Angela Washington reflected on how their family's experience had led to her expanded civil rights practice and her work with federal agencies to develop training programs that would prevent other families from experiencing the kind of discrimination and false accusations that had initially threatened to destroy their vacation and traumatize their children. Tyler Washington, now a freshman at Howard University, studying pre-law with a focus on federal civil rights enforcement, used his family's experience as the foundation for research papers and class discussions about the effectiveness of individual resistance to discrimination when combined with comprehensive federal oversight and corporate accountability. Zoe Washington, now confident in her understanding that discrimination could be successfully challenged and that federal laws existed to protect everyone's rights, had become a peer counselor for other young people who experienced prejudice, sharing her knowledge that authority figures could be held accountable when they abused their positions. The transformation of their airport experience from trauma to routine professionalism represented more than personal healing, but rather the broader success of federal civil rights enforcement in creating changes that protected the dignity and rights of all passengers, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or social status. As their plane descended toward Atlanta, David Washington looked out the window at the city below and reflected on how one family's refusal to accept discrimination had created ripple effects throughout the airline industry, demonstrating that individual courage combined with federal authority could still create meaningful progress in the ongoing struggle for civil rights and equal treatment under the law. The Washington family's dinner table had become a place where conversations about justice, courage, and personal responsibility were as natural as discussions about school assignments and weekend plans, reflecting how their confrontation with discrimination had deepened their understanding of both their own privileges and their obligations to challenge injustice whenever they encountered it in their daily lives. David Washington found himself changed by the experience of using his federal authority to protect not just his own family but countless other passengers who would benefit from the policy changes and civil rights enforcement that had resulted from their refusal to accept discriminatory treatment at O'Hare Airport. His work had expanded beyond technical aviation safety to include the broader mission of ensuring that civil rights protections were meaningful and enforceable throughout the transportation industry. Dad, do you ever regret calling Dr. Chen that day? Zoe asked during one of their family discussions, her question reflecting the kind of moral complexity that teenagers begin to grapple with as they develop their own sense of ethics and social responsibility. I mean, Linda Hayes lost everything. Her job, her pension, her freedom. Was it worth destroying someone's life? David considered his daughter's question, carefully understanding that his response would influence her developing sense of justice and her understanding of how power should be used when it's available to protect the vulnerable and challenge discrimination. His answer would help shape her approach to moral decision-making for the rest of her life. Sweetie, Linda Hayes didn't lose everything, because I made a phone call. David replied, his voice carrying the wisdom that comes from years of federal law enforcement and military service. She lost everything because she chose to abuse her authority, file false police reports, and treat our family with contempt and discrimination. My job was to ensure that her choices had appropriate consequences. Angela Washington added her perspective as someone whose career had been dedicated to defending the rights of people who couldn't defend themselves, helping her children understand that civil rights protections were meaningless without enforcement, and that individual acts of courage were necessary to maintain the legal frameworks that protected everyone's dignity and freedom. The difficult truth is that sometimes protecting civil rights requires holding people accountable for their actions, even when those consequences seem harsh. Angela said her legal training evident in her precise explanation of complex moral issues. Linda Hayes had multiple opportunities to treat us fairly, to listen to reason, to de-escalate the situation. Instead, she chose to escalate to lie, to weaponize law enforcement against an innocent family. Tyler Washington, now studying civil rights law and federal enforcement procedures, had developed a sophisticated understanding of how individual cases like their family's experience created precedents and policy changes that protected broader communities from discrimination and abuse of authority. His academic work was grounded in personal experience that most law students could only read about in textbooks. The family had also maintained correspondence with Linda Hayes during her federal incarceration and probation period, not out of friendship but from a recognition that understanding the human cost of discrimination required acknowledging the complexity of how prejudice and corporate pressure could destroy lives on both sides of civil rights violations. Linda's letters from prison had expressed genuine remorse for her actions and gratitude for the Washington family's support of her early release and rehabilitation programs, acknowledging that their willingness to focus on education and prevention rather than pure punishment had given her an opportunity to make meaningful amends for the harm she had caused. I know that what I did was wrong, and I know that my prejudices and poor judgment caused your family trauma that could have been avoided if I had been a better person and a more professional employee, Linda had written in one of her letters. I hope that my work now in training other airline employees can prevent other families from experiencing what you went through. The restoration of trust and dignity that had been damaged by the original incident required ongoing effort from all parties involved, But the Washington family's commitment to transformative justice rather than purely punitive responses had created opportunities for healing and learning that benefited everyone touched by the case. Zoe Washington had grown from a traumatized 13-year-old into a confident young woman who understood her rights, knew how to document discrimination, and possessed the courage to challenge injustice when she encountered it in her own life or witnessed it happening to others. Her experience had taught her that authority figures were not infallible, and that individual citizens could successfully demand accountability. Tyler Washington's college career had been shaped by his family's experience with federal civil rights enforcement, leading him to intern with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and develop expertise in transportation law that would prepare him for a career protecting other families from experiencing the kind of discrimination his own family had faced. The broader impact of their case continued to resonate throughout the airline industry and federal law enforcement agencies, creating training programs, policy changes, and oversight mechanisms that would protect millions of passengers for years to come, while demonstrating that individual courage, combined with institutional authority, could still create meaningful progress toward equal treatment and human dignity. As the Washington family reflected on their journey from victims of discrimination to advocates for civil rights, they understood that their experience represented both the ongoing reality of prejudice in American society and the possibility of challenging that prejudice successfully when people were willing to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal and professional risks involved. The Washington case became a landmark in aviation civil rights, leading to the Federal Aviation Equity Act of 2026 that mandated comprehensive bias training for all airline personnel and established independent oversight boards to investigate discrimination complaints. Linda Hayes completed her rehabilitation successfully and now works with civil rights organizations nationwide training airline employees about the real-world consequences of discriminatory behavior and helping companies develop policies that protect both passengers and employees. The Washington family established a scholarship fund for underrepresented youth pursuing careers in aviation and federal law enforcement, understanding that lasting change requires diverse voices in positions of authority throughout the transportation industry. Zoe graduated as valedictorian of her high school class and studies aerospace engineering at MIT, while Tyler became a federal civil rights attorney specializing in transportation discrimination cases that build on the legal precedents established by their family's experience. David Washington's airport safety and civil rights protocols became the national standard across the aviation industry, transforming how airlines approach customer service and employee training. His quiet revolution proved that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is not anger or resignation, but the steady application of principle backed by authority used wisely and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the personal cost seems too high to bear. What do you think about this story of justice served? If you found this tale of transformation inspiring, please hit that like button to help others discover how individual courage can create lasting change. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that show how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they refuse to accept discrimination and abuse of power.